Okay, folks, looking more at the Cold War at home, the early Cold War. You can protect yourself from radioactive fallout. Get the facts. Well, if you are close enough to see something that looks like the size of that mushroom cloud, I think the advice that those drill sergeants gave to me in 1983 are probably going to be good for you. Nevertheless, here's children ducking and covering. Yay, being good Americans, obeying their teachers. Well, we really create the national security state after World War II. This is the beginning of that culture of paranoia. Culture of paranoia was not something that just happened as a result of September 11th. The culture of paranoia began immediately after the end of World War II. The creation of the national security state. During World War II, there were approximately 900,000 Americans employed by the federal government. 10% of those were in national security. By 1946, 4 million Americans worked for the federal government, and 75% of that in national security. So, 75% of 4 million is 3. There are 3 million federal employees in national security. There was only 900,000 federal employees during the height of World War II. The Pentagon had 35,000 employees. In 1947, Congress passes the National Security Act. The National Security Act established a couple things. One, the National Security Agency, NSA, known by those of us that worked with them, the agency. And it created the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, known as the company. Next, the National Security Act of 1947 established the National Security Council. The National Security Council was a group of advisors to the president to advise him on national security stuff. On March 21st, 1947, Truman signed the Executive Order 9835, also known as the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. The Federal Employee Loyalty Program said the following. 1, no communists, no homosexuals, or anyone, quote, sympathetic to communists or homosexuals could work for the federal government. In 1950, Congress passed the Internal Security Act. The Internal Security Act required communists to register with the federal government, specifically with an organization called the, quote, Subversive Activities Control Board. The Internal Security Act of 1950 authorizes the U.S. government to arrest all communists or communist sympathizers during a national emergency. This law will be on the books until 1973. In 1952, we have the Immigration Act of 52. The Immigration Act of 1952 prohibited homosexuals from ever becoming U.S. citizens. Texas Representative Martin Dies had chaired the House Committee on Un-American Activities since 1938. And he tells the press in 1944 that the greatest source of communist propaganda came from Hollywood. Well, Dies is no longer in Congress, and his committee is renamed HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, in 1945, and its new leader is a guy named James Parnell Thomas. And James Parnell Thomas decides to continue the work of his predecessor and fetter out all those godless communists in Hollywood. And he personally creates a list of what he calls suspected communists. He asks for, quote, good Americans to come forth to give testimony to the communist elements in Hollywood. Well, one of these was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, a man who did not serve in World War II, got deferments, a guy who will become governor of California and president of the United States. Once again, someone who did not serve in the military, someone who got deferments, meaning they received the blessings of the federal government not to have to lay one's life down for this country's security. His name, Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was naming names. Well, a group of Hollywood actors, led by Humphrey Bogart, protested HUAC and refused to name names. Well, many on J. Parnell Thomas's list were blacklisted. They were prevented from ever working again. Writers, producers, directors, actors. So what kept Hollywood from hiring these people who J. Parnell Thomas said, without any evidence, are communist or communist sympathizers? Well, their license. You needed a license to run a TV station. You had a license to run a movie company. So you want that license revoked? Then go ahead and hire someone who J. Parnell Thomas says is a communist or a communist sympathizer. In 1976, Woody Allen did a movie called The Front. The Front was about, well, HUAC and the Red Scare. And in The Front, a bunch of friends of Woody Allen, who were writers and producers and directors and behind-the-scenes guys, came to Woody Allen and said, we're going to give you scripts and ideas for shows, and you're going to present them as your own. Hopefully you'll get hired and paid, and you give us a percentage. This actually was happening in the United States. Woody Allen's character was fronting for the suspected communists. Well, eventually Woody Allen will be found out. He will be brought before HUAC. He refuses to name names. He refuses to testify, and he's thrown in federal prison. The movie came out in 1976, and a lot of people did not like it because 1976 was the bicentennial, and it was supposed to be a year of celebration, not in a year of remembering how the federal government ruined the lives of thousands and thousands of people. Whittaker Chambers was a magazine editor and was an announced communist. And he was brought before HUAC in 1948. Chambers said not only was a communist, but that he spied for the Soviet Union, and HUAC said, I want to know the other names. We are not afraid of the thing. We are afraid of the unknown thing. If we can identify a monster, we can watch that monster. It's the monsters we have yet to identify. We don't like communism, but once we get someone to say they're a communist, now we can watch them, now we know. The scarier part is, who are the unknown communists? Who are those amongst us who are working for the godless Soviet Union? And so that's what HUAC asked Chambers. You're a communist, you worked for the Soviet Union, tell us who else was there. And he says Elger Hiss. Elger Hiss was a State Department official and an advisor to President Roosevelt, who was at Yalta. And so some said that's why Roosevelt allowed Stalin to make the promise of free elections, because FDR was old and weak. He'll die shortly after Yalta. And because Elger Hiss, his advisor, was a communist and told him to do so. Well, Elger Hiss will be brought to trial, and there was no evidence that were brought against him. Elger Hiss is asked a bunch of questions. One of the questions he's asked is, did he ever meet Whittaker Chambers? And he says no. And so he's on the stand, and they ask him more and more questions, and well, he'll be found guilty. Not of being a communist, not of being a spy, but perjury. And the court will find that he perjured, he lied about meeting Chambers. That Whittaker Chambers and Elger Hiss actually met at a party. And so for that, he's going to spend 5 years in a federal prison. Well, next we have Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Definitely known spies. At least one of them. How did the Soviet Union get the bomb so fast? Well, in part because Ethel Rosenberg sold U.S. atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Who tipped off the federal government? Who told the federal government that Julius Rosenberg was a spy? Well, a fellow named Greenglass. Can't remember his first name on top of my head. Greenglass. Greenglass was, boop, Ethel Rosenberg's brother. So his brother-in-law, her brother, told the FBI that his sister and brother-in-law are communist spies. Well, Julius Rosenberg will be found guilty. Ethel Rosenberg will also be found guilty. There is tremendous evidence that Julius Rosenberg did this. He was a traitor. He was a spy. He'll be put to death. Ethel Rosenberg, his wife, will be found guilty of being a spy, of being a traitor. She'll be sentenced to death. The real reason that Ethel Rosenberg was put to death was just to be on the safe side, was the idea that she should have known. She was in the house when these activities were taking place, thus she was probably aware of them. And so Ethel and Julius Rosenberg will be put to death at Sing Sing Prison in upstate New York on June 16th, 1953. Einstein asked for clemency. The Pope asked for clemency. And then we have Joe McCarthy, Republican from Wisconsin. One term. One term. That's it. And he is way behind in the polls for re-election because he didn't do anything. He was a raging alcoholic that spent most of his time drinking. Didn't introduce legislation, rarely voted, didn't give speeches, just went to D.C. and drank for several years. So he needs something to get his re-election campaign going. On February 9th, 1950, McCarthy gives a speech in West Virginia in which he says he has a list of 200 known communists who are working for the Department of the Army. Well, so the reporters asked for names. He says, I'm not offering the names. He just whipped out a piece of paper. Now, he was a heavy drinker. He will die of alcoholism. Well, shortly after that speech, he's drunk. And he's with a reporter. And the reporter asks him, come on, give me a name, tell me something. And McCarthy says, quote, I'm not going to tell you anything. I just want you to know I've got a pail full of shit and I'm going to use it where it does me the most good. That quote never made it into any U.S. newspapers. But clearly, what McCarthy in his drunken state told this reporter is that this is all for show. Well, between 1950 and 1954, McCarthy led a senatorial committee to fetter out the known communists working for the Department of the Army. And it's televised. And you know how many communists he discovered? 0. Better dead than red. That was their slogan. Well, McCarthy didn't just stop with communists. He went after all groups he thought were un-American. He went after the NAACP. He had W.E.B. Du Bois exiled, kicked out of this country. He went after the National Organization of Women. He went after all these organizations that he determined to be un-American, and he drank throughout these televised conferences. So as the day went on, he became more and more and more unintelligible. And Americans are watching this. Well, eventually in 1954, we have a new president. We have Eisenhower. And McCarthy starts saying that Eisenhower had known communists working for him. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander who directs D-Day. Well, one of the lawyers for the Army was a guy named Joseph Welch. Oh, this is the photograph here of the TV show of McCarthy and Welch going back and forth in June of '54, and Welch just gets so disappointed, so upset with McCarthy's insane drunken questions. He just puts his head down. Welch puts his head down and just starts saying, "Have you no shame? Have you no shame? Have you no shame?" This is going to result in thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans sending telegrams, sending letters, making phone calls to their senators saying, pull the plug on McCarthy. The Senate does, and they censure him. They pass a resolution saying that McCarthy went way beyond his powers. Many Americans eventually will be stripped of their passports. Oh, by the way, who was the lead attorney for McCarthy? A future president. One who will lie to us about Vietnam. One who said if elected as president, he has a secret plan for getting us out of Vietnam, and he wouldn't show it. He said, elect me and I'll show you. After he becomes president, he expands the war in Vietnam by invading Laos and Cambodia. And then as president, he wants to reassure his election, so he breaks into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and he breaks into the doctor's offices of the Democratic president and vice president nominee. And his name? Richard Nixon. Ah, the age of anxiety. 50% of the world's wealth. That's what we own. The U.S. owned 50% of the world's wealth, but only